Welcome to Australian Hunger. I am your host, Ben. I've got a really cool interview today because it's actually one of my first unsolicited interviews. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. It's with The Ocean, also known as The Ocean Collective. Their recently released album, Phanerozoic I, Palaeozoic, part 1 of a 3-part trilogy, which interestingly enough, the other 2 parts will both be released in 2020, I think in a single volume. Very interesting approach, but I mean, they're dealing with different ages, aeons, geographical periods of the world, so you've got to divide it up somehow, and I guess that's just how they've chosen to divide it up. I mentioned that this interview was unsolicited, and what I mean by that is, generally with most bands I've interviewed, I'll hear their music, I'll say, they're a cool band, they've recently released something, and I want to talk to them about it. And I'll reach out, sometimes through their label, but most times just directly to them. I'll send them an email and say, hey, this is what I'm doing, I do a podcast, do you want to come on and have a chat about your release album? And generally they'll say yes, and thank you so much for them for agreeing to give up their time, and we'll have a chat about it. Not so much with The Ocean and these kind of interviews. So I'm on a couple of media lists, which means I get sent press releases by PR people and labels. Some of them are emails saying this band is available for interviews at these times, which then means you can select a particular time and interview the band. Very different situation, because in this chain of events you have no direct contact with the band until you're actually talking to them. Whereas otherwise you'd actually directly set it up with the band at some other time, not some designated time which you have to choose between. And it's a really different experience. So it's a little bit more freewheeling when you're interviewing a band which you've solicited them specifically. But when it's unsolicited, you've only got a specific set of time, usually about 20 minutes, which is far less than most of the bands I interview. Most I like to go for about 40 minutes. That enables me to get through all my questions. And in kind of a way, it's a little bit annoying because it's restrictive. It means that you can't ask all your questions. It means that there's topics you have to cut away, and that's not necessarily the way I like to do things. It probably would be better if I cut my interviews a little bit more, edit them a little bit more, so they'd be a bit more, digestible, but that's not really the show that I'm interested in doing it, so that's not the show I do. I do the show I want to do it. But there is definitely a benefit for doing an interview with an unsolicited band. So although sometimes they're a bit wary of being asked the same questions a lot, it also means that they're used to being interviewed, and they're generally a bit better at being interviewed. No offense to any of the bands I've been interviewing. I love them because they're natural, and that's really what I'm getting at. But they've probably been asked the same question over and over again, so they've developed a really clear, concise answer to it. They're generally, better talkers just because of natural development. I mean, it's one of the interesting things that I ask people on here to be interviewed, and they're not professional being interviewed peoples. That's not their job. Their job is to play music, basically. So you're kind of an interesting situation, whereas the people who organise through the labels and have lots and lots of interviews all over the world, they've done this a lot of times. So they've got a lot of practice, and they've gotten quite good at it, some of them. Some of them aren't as good, and it's an interesting question in itself. But no, it is interesting. Very, very different experience between those two things. And although I definitely prefer having as much time as possible to talk to the band and ask all my questions, no matter how sometimes minute they are, the fact that you have to only ask 20 minutes worth of questions does mean that the interview's a bit tighter. It's a little bit more, you're asking the best questions, hoping to get the best answers. So I mean, if you were hoping to produce a more tight show, then those are definitely the people you go for, because just the nature of it forces you to sort of be a better interviewer in a kind of way. And I mean that in just a way that's it's tighter, it's more interesting. And anyway, regardless of how I feel about different types of interviews, Robin Staps, who I interviewed from the ocean, really good. I've talked to him before, back when I think he was touring Australia. I think it might have been in 2015. Actually, one of the first people I interviewed ever. I interviewed like 5 people the first year I was doing interviews. And yeah, he was one of the first ones. So it's kind of interesting how it's come around like that. But regardless, Phanerozoic I, Palaeozoic, Robin Staps of the ocean. I play 2 songs in the interview. The first one is Cambrian II, Eternal Recurrence, and the one at the end is Permian, the Great Dying. Now, let's start off with the album. So you released Pelagian in 2013. When did you start working on this one?
The new record has pretty much been written over the course of the past couple of summers, since 2014. So yeah, 2014, 2015, and a small part still in 2016. I can't write when I'm on tour or when I'm at home, so I always retreat to a house near the ocean in Spain over the summer months, and this is when most of the writing happens.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. That's really interesting. I'm kind of fascinated by the kind of things people do. Like, some people just kind of write. Some people need to really get in a kind of zone to get the best out of what they're doing. What is it about that environment that is where you write your material?
I don't know. I can't really write when I'm in my usual comfort zone just because there's so many distractions. And I live in Berlin. It's a massive city with 4 million inhabitants. And, there's always like friends and the internet and gigs. And I just can't really find the peace of mind to really put myself in that zone. So I really need to take myself out to a place where there's no distractions and where I'm surrounded by nature and not just looking at the next building 20 meters away. So it just works for me much better when I'm somehow close to nature, and especially to the ocean. It's just such an inspiring thing somehow, so that every time I get to this place, it takes me only a couple of hours and ideas start floating, basically, so it's very much related to where we are and the immediate environment. And that's partially also why we decided to start recording this record in Iceland this year. The idea was that it's a cold, kind of like rough record, and we wanted to put ourselves in an environment that is kind of like fitting for that, for that particular type of sound that we were after. And that's why we decided to go to Iceland to start tracking drums there. That was the first stage in the process. That was the making of this record, and this first stage always very much has an impact on the actual outcome of the record and the sound of the record. And yeah, that's why we went to Iceland, and it was the best choice we could have made, with a beautiful studio there, built by the guys in Sigur Rós. It was like a frozen waterfall right behind the studio, and we were just like really in nature out there, and then easily reach that stage where everything just goes very, very smooth between Paul, the drummer, and myself, and the engineer who recorded the drums.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the kind of sort of aspects beyond just the equipment you're using, like how all these different things really impact kind of the performance. You released a few albums already that are complementary to each other: Fluxian, Aeolian, Heliocentric and Anthropocentric. Why did you choose to release an album, 2 volumes of a piece, this album and the next album that's going to follow?
I think I have this strange fascination for duality somehow. Like you said, like all of our records have always had these like 2 sides to them, where they were like kind of like thesis and antithesis in a way. Fluxian Aeolian and Precambrian was actually a double record as well, with 2 discs, and then heliocentric, anthropocentric, and this new record now as well. It actually comes in 3 parts, but that's only going to be released in 2 separate albums. So the first part is Phanerozoic I, Palaeozoic, and then the second part is Phanerozoic II, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. But altogether, it's 3 eras in Earth's history that these records are kind of like tackling. So yeah, I don't really know why I have this desire to do that. I guess one reason is that by the time we're ready to enter the studio, there's always more material written than what can fit on a single record. And especially this time, people's attention span is so short these days. We didn't want to overload, our audience with like 2.5 hours of music released at once when everyone is literally only listening to the first like 5 or 6 tracks anyway. So that was like part of the reason why we decided to split it up again in 2 separate volumes. The other thing is that stylistically, with all of these double albums we've released, it's always been quite diverse material, and I always felt that it's a better idea to kind of split it up. So with Fluxion and Aeolian, the heavier, faster songs ended up on Aeolian, and the more orchestral songs ended up on Fluxion. And with this new record, it was kind of like that as well. The first half of it is very stripped down to the bare musical ideas. It's very riff focused and kind of like slow and yeah, like it feels a little bit reduced as compared to our previous record, Pelagial, which was really overloaded with ideas, and complexity. And the second half, Palaeozoic II, that's going to be released sometime in 2020, is more elaborate somehow. It's more intricate. It's more complex songs, and stylistically, it's also a little different from the first part as well. So, yeah, that's the other thing, that there's always like this band is comprising a fairly large stylistic range, and I always find it more interesting to somehow split that up to records rather than to mix it all together within, the context of one record.
I read that this sort of is meant to fit the gap between Precambrian and heliocentric and anthropocentric. Talk a little bit about how that works kind of thematically or musically.
Well, Phanerozoic is the next consecutive eon in Earth's history after the Precambrian, and heliocentric was kind of the record that marked the arrival of humanity, if you want. So like the first song, Firmament, starts off with original text from the Bible. So there was this gap between Precambrian, which we released in 2007, and heliocentric, and we wanted to somehow fill that gap both musically and conceptually. Musically, Precambrian was kind of like the last record of the old ocean, if you want. So it's we've had a totally different lineup back then. We've had a different vocalist, or actually a number of vocalists singing on that record. Heliocentric, which came out 3 years later, was the first record that Loic, our current vocalist, sang on, and I think he really transformed the path of this band in the coming years and the albums that followed. So we wanted to somehow make a record that reconciles the old ocean with the new ocean, and that reconciles or like bridges the gap between Precambrian and heliocentric. And I feel that this new record is doing that. And that was one of my initial thoughts when I was actually listening to the pre-productions, because they had this Precambrian vibe. They're kind of like these really heavy riffs, and this rough overall vibe to it is very Precambrian-ish, if you want. So, but then with Loic singing over it, it has the feel of the contemporary ocean more than what the band was back then. So yeah, we were listening to this material and then thinking that this is what this album is going to be, probably. And yeah, that's why we ended up there, both musically and conceptually somehow.
speaking of the conceptual aspects, like one thing that's really interesting about your band is you talk about stuff that a lot of bands, aren't really kind of inserting into their music, concepts of Earth's geology, really kind of dry stuff, but you really sort of bring it to life. Talk about how that's kind of continued to be interesting to you, sort of as the band's gone on in its lifetime.
Yeah, I always end up with these prehistoric images somehow when I actually listen to the music that I write. It just what comes to mind, or what I see in front of my inner eye, is usually grand images of nature, like raging stormy seas or outbreaking volcanoes or whatever. It just seems like appropriate visual metaphory for the type of music that we're doing. It just fits very well, and I think that's how I initially ended up with the idea to make Cambrian. And now it was kind of like that again when I was listening to the pre-productions. I was like, yeah, this really has that vibe, and it's like a bit of like a reverse soundtrack. The music is there first, and then we try to visualize the music, and then we always end up with these prehistoric landscapes, and yeah, it just seems like the right fit for this type of music, I guess.
Talking a little bit about you coming down to play here next year, how'd you get involved with the Progfest that you're going to be headlining?
Well, Progfest is run by the agent that brought us over for our previous two Australian tours, Wild Thing Records and Wild Thing Booking. They're also licensing our new album now for the record label that they just started. And we've been talking to them for a long time. We were aware of Progfest, and I told Ellie the last time that we'd be super excited to do that. And this time the timing was right. We have a new record out, and we know exactly what we're letting ourselves in for, because we've worked with the guys before. They're really great, hardworking people, and they have helped build up this band in Australia a fair bit. And so we're very excited to come over now as part of Progfest, and hopefully play to an audience that also consists of some people that haven't seen us live before. So that's very, very cool. There's also going to be some extra side shows to be announced fairly soon, I think. So it's not just going to be Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. There's going to be, I think, 2 more shows as well.
Oh, that's really, really exciting. I've seen you guys before, and it's definitely really excited to see you guys come down to Melbourne. When you guys play live, like, there's a lot of different aspects to your music. This is kind of a weird question that I like to ask people, and bear with me. But like, when you're playing live, what are you trying to do? What's your aim when you're playing live?
Immersion for ourselves and for the audience, I guess. Like, we're trying to get ourselves into the zone and the people that watch the show as well, and to immerse them in this this ocean of sound that we create. I've always been intrigued by bands that kind of suck you into their cosmos from the beginning to the end of the show and don't let you out in between, that don't disrupt the thing it is that they're doing by like talking to the crowd or interacting, but they just start a show and then it finishes like an hour and a half later, and in between you don't have time to breathe. And that's, I think, what subliminally I've also always tried to do with the ocean. It's ideally, if it works out, and it doesn't always work out, I can tell you that. But if it does work out, then it's a bit of a trance state, both for us as musicians as for the crowd. We see that because the crowd usually doesn't see much of us because we have all this backlight, but that means that the light is actually shining into the crowd, so we see their faces, but they can't see us. So that's good. A lot of times you just see people with closed eyes, and if you turned off the music entirely and would just film them, then you would get this impression that people are in a trance. So that's like ideally how it can work out, but obviously that depends on a lot of factors. You have to let yourself in for that, both as a musician as well as if you're in the crowd. And if the sound and lighting and everything has to just be spot on and perfect. If something isn't really sounding well, or if there's technical issues, then it doesn't usually work out that well. But in the best case scenario, it does.
No, I can definitely relate to that kind of experience as an audience member. Last question. You've referenced Friedrich Nietzsche multiple times in the past. Like, what is it about him and his writings that interests you?
He's very powerful with words. I just really love how he uses words to manipulate people if he wants to, or to get his point across. I think he's more of a novelist really than a philosopher. You know, his philosophy isn't really scientific in a way, but it's very, very powerful metaphor that he uses for getting his points across. And I've always been intrigued by that, even as a 15 or 16-year-old when I was first exposed to him. And he's a diehard criticizer of Christianity, which I am as well. And we've made that the topic of two of our records in the past, heliocentric and anthropocentric. So obviously when you discuss Christianity and Christian religion, then you can't get around Friedrich Nietzsche. So he's been very present in the lyrics of those two records. And now on the new record as well, the first track, Cambrian, Eternal Recurrence, that is an old Nietzsche idea. Eternal recurrence is the idea that things happen over and over again. No matter if you look at your own lifespan or at Earth's history, as in our case here, you will find countless evidence for that, like continents colliding and drifting apart and colliding again, and coral reefs going extinct, but then flaring back up in other parts of the planet, etc. So everything is happening over and over again. And that's an idea that Nietzsche has not invented, but very strongly promoted. Eternal recurrence is something you find in all of his writings. But the idea itself is actually as old as humanity. It was found in old Hinduistic writings. The old Egyptians had it. And then it somehow sank into oblivion a bit with the arrival of the Occident, because the Christians, again, didn't really like the idea of eternal recurrence, which involves some element of arbitrariness and chance, and that didn't really comply with the idea of one unique creation, created by one unique God. So they didn't like it, and Nietzsche brought it back, and he was very fond of that idea. And this is kind of like a topic not only for the first track of the record, but something that reoccurs throughout the album. It's an album about time and perception of time and recurrence, and the fact that there are things that happen in our lives that we can't really change and that will happen again and again and again. And how do we deal with that? That's kind of like the red thread that goes a little bit through this first record, Phanerozoic I, Palaeozoic.
Permian, The Great Dying, and the track in the middle was Cambrian II, Eternal Recurrence, both from the oceans Phanerozoic I, Palaeozoic. Thanks again for Rob and Staps for taking the time to talk to me. Before I finish off this episode, I want to recommend an album that was released just the other week. It is The Blink of Our Constants by Eneferens, a one-man metal band from Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. And it's really, really cool, right up my alley. So this atmospheric black gaze, this combination of all these kind of alternate forms of black metal that I'm really a big fan of. But where I think it really, really tops itself, and I haven't yet gone back and listened to his previous work, but when I mean top itself, it really is a shining example of this genre, is because not only is it have all the hallmarks of this particular style of black metal, atmosphere and beauty to it, it also has progressive aspects which you just don't find enough in this kind of music. Almost sometimes I felt like it was a black metal cousin of Opeth in a certain way. Definitely not to Opeth's particular high standing of particularly those first records. I mean, like maybe first 6 or 8 records it would have been. But it had a flavour of it. It definitely had a flavour of it. So I definitely recommend you check it out. The Blink of Our Constant by Eneferens. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for an interview with Grezvik and Shallow Grave. Interview that I just finished, actually. Really, really good talking to those guys. And I hope you enjoy your weekend.